what's the role of money in this transition? It could be the different buckets of philanthropic focused money, investment capital, and later we'll hear a case study actually later in today with Alfonso, and also government, the subsidy schemes. You touched upon that, Charles, as well. So if you would unpack the three of them, let's say government or institutional money, or institutional from the government in this case, the philanthropic side, and investment capital. Have you experience with all three? And if so, yes, or would you like to? What has been in your operation, in your transition, and also in the future, what has been going on there?
Alfonso, do you want to go?
Okay. We used all of them. At the beginning, for the experiments, it was some savings to see what would we, which direction would go, which techniques would we start using on a wider scale, and which crops were working, because at that time we only had barley and oats, and that was clearly not just what we wanted to do. We wanted to try more things, but in our area, yeah, it's a complicated climate. So at least the neighbors around said that nothing else would work. So we had to start a bit from scratch doing experiments.
I've heard that many times from farmers, that their neighbors have said, you can only do this and this, and then it turns out to be slightly different. Yeah.
So a lot of it was basically reinvestment, where our profits would come, then a lot of bank money. We got big loans for doing a lot of that transition and new crops. And also we got some donations money for some of the experiments we were doing, especially for the early stage, to build the first ponds, first hedges, and first swales that we made in the farm. We received from a foundation and association that we are members with, that it does focus on ecosystem restoration and regenerative agriculture in the southeast of Spain. And that, together with a lot of the networking and the people we met and visiting other farms, I would say that network and that knowledge was as important and helpful as a lot of the funding and the money coming in. At the beginning, we had also a big reduction of subsidies, because we started changing crops in the middle of the cap period. And then, for example, the organic for subsidies, for the subsidy for organic, it depends on the crop. If you change the crop and the first year of the period, then you lose it for the next 7 years. And that was a pity. We should have started 1 or 2 years earlier. But then since last year, we now receive it for all of the crops we have, because we changed. At that moment, we had 1,800 hectares that we were managing, of which 1,100 were grains, and that we've been changing into almonds, aromatic plants, pistachios. Now we grow wheat, barley, rye, oats, and legumes. And then on a smaller scale, also a little bit of, on a tiny part, we are irrigating apple trees and vegetables. Yeah, so that subsidy money now is helping that we start receiving that before we were not. And that is in our own operation. In the case of the partnership with SLM, I think we will expand more later.
Yeah, so just this is there will be a full session on that partnership with SLM later this afternoon. And what about you, Charles?
I think the biggest thing that helped us go was the government funding that we got. We have a 2-year transition period, which enables us to make that switch, whereby we can put down the fertility building phase of the crop, or the rotation, so clover, grass mixtures, to build fertility, and then begin to benefit from that in years 3 and 4 and further on. So the government funding was really the only funding, apart from our own internal funding, that we were able to tap into at that point in time. But without it, we would have struggled. I don't think we probably would have gone down that road.
And has that changed? Like now, actually, somebody's asking in the chat, like, is there a business case now without the subsidies? To both of you, actually, let's say Charles first, to transition
certainly
with institutional capital?
In England, the subsidy, if you go organic, is out there. And I think what isn't out there is making that switch from conventional to sort of all-out regen ag without actually going organic. They're beginning in the UK. They're beginning to, in effect, pay for some types of systems. So a particular method of farming or practice of no-tilling and some things like that, and cover crops. We are beginning to get small amounts of payments to enable farmers to make that transition, reduce their amounts of fertilizer, reduce their amounts of chemicals, in order to drive down what we believe is the right direction of actually having no fertilizer and no chemicals. So it is out there, but it is I think for a lot of farmers going forward, not willing to switch to organics and jump in 100%, where they will get funding in the UK, and it is quite reasonable to make that transition over those 2 years. But for those who don't want to do that, it probably is a much slower process.
And for you, Alfonso, you mentioned I took on loans, and now you, of course, work with an investment fund. Do you see that that business case to be there?
There's definitely a business case to be there. The thing is that the timings, in our case, if it is a family farm, let's say in the case of La Junquera, every penny we could get was we needed to use it for the transition. The periods are quite long. So, for example, to be able to transform a lot of the land into new crops, let's say almond trees, that they would take 5 to 6 years to start getting the first harvest, would mean that you need to spend a lot more money and then not get the income from that part, plus reducing the subsidies because of changing the crop. And then we would go to the bank, and at that time when we started diversifying, the banks were not so used to longer term loans for that. So we needed a combination of a lot of things. If, for example, with institutional money, I would say it's a lot easier that if we're in a family farm, on top of doing that investment, higher cost and low returns for 6 years, and you need as a family to survive and be able to make a living from it at the same time. It is very different than if you come with a lot of money at the beginning. You can do all of the investments you need from day one, and then you don't need to be extracting money in the next 6 years. Then you can do the transition a lot faster. So I think it is easier in that way to do that, definitely.